Pierce Brosnan. I'd like to talk about some of the roles that I've played in my life.
At 72, Pierce Brosnan is remembered by millions as the suave and unshakable James Bond. But behind the red carpets and blockbuster films lies a life marked by unimaginable pain. His journey is not just about fame or success, but about survival, heartbreak, and resilience in the face of tragedy. Join us as we uncover the story behind the man and reveal why Pierce Brosnan's life has been far more heartbreaking than the world ever knew. A boy without a father. Pierce Brosnan's story begins in Drogheda, Ireland, where he was born on May 16, 1953. His start in life was far from easy. His family did not have wealth, and almost immediately he was left without a father. His father, Thomas Brosnan, worked as a carpenter, but when Pierce was still just a baby, Thomas walked out. He never returned. Pierce grew up without even the memory of him, knowing only that the man who gave him his name was gone. This early absence shaped much of Pierce's childhood. His mother, May, was left on her own to raise him. She was determined to provide for her son, but opportunities in their small Irish town were few. In 1957, when Pierce was only 4 years old, May made a heartbreaking choice. She left Ireland to find work in London, hoping it would only be for a short while. That short while stretched into 7 long years. During that time, young Pierce was passed between different relatives. First, he lived with his grandparents in Navan. Later, he was sent to live with his aunt and uncle in Trim. Each move came with new rules, new routines, and new ways of living. For a small boy, it created a constant feeling of instability. Home was never permanent. Nothing ever felt secure. In these years, Pierce learned to be quiet and careful. He was the child who stayed out of the way, who kept to himself, and who watched more than he spoke. Teachers noticed that he had something different about him. Behind his silence, there was a sharp intelligence and a deep curiosity. He often sat by windows, staring outside as if searching for something he could not name. The loneliness of his early life gave him a habit of looking outward, waiting for a world that seemed just out of reach. Finally, when Pierce was 11, his mother returned to Ireland. By then, she was married again, this time to William Carmichael. Unlike the father who had abandoned him, William was steady and kind. He never tried to replace the man who had left. Instead, he guided Pierce in gentle ways, teaching him to fish, showing him how to fix things, and above all, teaching him to trust again. For a boy who had grown up in pieces, this was a gift. That same year, William took Pierce to the cinema. It was 1964, and the film was Goldfinger. On the screen, Sean Connery appeared as James Bond, confident, fearless, and larger than life. For the young boy sitting in the dark, the impact was immediate. Pierce thought to himself, "That's the man I want to be." It was the spark of a dream that would stay with him for decades. A fire eater sparks destiny. As a teenager, Pierce Brosnan didn't dream of Hollywood or the spotlight. His first passion was art. When he was 16, he moved to London and enrolled at St. Martin's School of Art. His goal was to become a painter. He admired the works of Francis Bacon and Lucian Freud, artists who used bold colors and intense images. Pierce imagined his own future filled with brushes, paint, and canvas. He lived on very little, sometimes just toast and tea, while classmates around him enjoyed more comfortable lives. Even then, he was determined to keep going, focused on developing his craft and making something of himself. But life has a way of changing plans. In 1971, when Pierce was 18, he happened to wander into a small theater workshop. Inside, a man was rehearsing a fire-eating act for a performance. Curious, Pierce asked if he could try it. What seemed like a random decision turned into a life-altering moment. When he stepped forward to give it a go, the people around him saw something unexpected. He had a natural presence, a quiet intensity, and an energy that drew attention. The theater troupe invited him to stay, and from that day on, the path of his life shifted. This chance encounter eventually led Pierce to apply to the Drama Centre London. The school was one of the toughest acting programs in the country. Training there wasn't glamorous, it was strict, demanding, and exhausting. Students were pushed to their limits, expected to master everything from Shakespeare to mime to circus skills. By 1976, his years of training began to pay off. He landed his first professional stage role in the thriller Wait Until Dark. His performance showed he could hold his own in serious theater. A year later, he starred in Tennessee Williams' The Red Devil Battery Sign. The play had failed in the United States, but in London, Pierce's performance gave it new life and drew attention to his talent. Slowly, his name began to mean something in acting circles. The early film roles soon followed, though they were small. In 1980, he appeared briefly in The Mirror Cracked alongside Elizabeth Taylor. His part lasted less than 30 seconds, and he earned only £50 for it. That same year, he also appeared in The Long Good Friday with Bob Hoskins and Helen Mirren. The role was minor, but the film went on to become a cult classic. For Pierce, these early roles were steps forward. They weren't glamorous, but they built experience and credibility. And soon, his determination would lead him to a television role that would change everything: the Remington Steele years. By the early 1980s, Pierce Brosnan was still working steadily but was far from being a household name. That changed in 1982 when he auditioned for a small background role on a new NBC detective show called Remington Steele. What happened next surprised everyone, including Pierce himself. Instead of being given a minor part, the producers saw something in him that fit perfectly with the lead role. Almost overnight, he was offered the part of Remington Steele, the charming, mysterious con man who teams up with a private detective. When Remington Steele premiered on October 1, 1982, it was an instant hit. The series pulled in around 15.6 million weekly viewers in the United States and was broadcast in more than 80 countries. Pierce went from a struggling young actor to an international star almost immediately. His elegance, wit, and smooth screen presence made him a favorite with fans. Many critics compared him to classic movie stars, saying he had the kind of style and charisma audiences had been missing. It didn't take long for people to start connecting him to another famous role, James Bond. His performance as Steele, sophisticated, confident, and a little mysterious, reminded viewers of 007. Magazine articles began calling him the next James Bond, and fans quickly picked up the idea. This wasn't just idle talk. In 1983, Bond producer Albert "Cubby" Broccoli himself noticed Pierce when he visited the set of For Your Eyes Only. Brosnan's wife at the time, actress Cassandra Harris, had a part in the film, and when Broccoli saw Pierce visiting her, he reportedly said, "If he can act, he's my guy." It looked like destiny was aligning, but timing worked against him more than once. In 1985, Roger Moore, who had already been playing Bond for over a decade, was ready to step down. The studio prepared to find a new 007, and Brosnan's name was high on the list. Yet at the last moment, Moore agreed to come back for one more film, pushing Pierce's chance aside. Then, in 1986, it seemed like his time had finally come. Remington Steele was canceled, freeing him to take on the Bond role just as the producers were searching again. Negotiations began, and Brosnan was close to signing. But before anything was finalized, NBC unexpectedly decided to revive Remington Steele for another season. Because of his contract, Pierce was forced to stay with the show, and the role of Bond went instead to his friend Timothy Dalton. But fate hadn't finished with him yet, and the call he had been waiting for was still on its way, becoming Bond at last. By the early 1990s, Pierce Brosnan had spent more than a decade circling around the role of James Bond. He had been passed over twice, and for years he carried the reputation of being the Bond who almost was. Then, in 1994, the call finally came. The producers of the series offered him the chance to step into the role of 007. This time, there were no contract conflicts and no last-minute changes. Pierce Brosnan was officially James Bond. His first Bond film, GoldenEye, was released in 1995, and the stakes could not have been higher. The Bond franchise was in trouble. The last film, License to Kill in 1989, had underperformed, and there was real doubt about whether audiences still cared about the famous spy. After 6 years without a Bond movie, many believed the series had lost its place in modern cinema. For Brosnan, this meant that his performance would decide not only his own career but also the future of an iconic character. The pressure was enormous, but he delivered. GoldenEye was a worldwide success, earning $353 million at the box office. The movie introduced Bond to a new generation while keeping the traditions that fans loved. Brosnan brought a mix of charm, toughness, and sensitivity to the role, which helped redefine the character for the 1990s. Audiences praised his ability to balance sophistication with action, and critics agreed that Bond was back. One of the most memorable moments of GoldenEye was the opening sequence, which featured a daring stunt, a bungee jump from a 220-meter dam. The producers considered it so dangerous that even insurance companies didn't want to cover it. But Brosnan insisted on performing much of the stunt work himself, determined to prove his commitment to the role. The scene went on to become one of the most famous openings in Bond history and set the tone for the kind of physical intensity he would bring to the part. Brosnan went on to star in 3 more Bond films after GoldenEye: Tomorrow Never Dies, The World Is Not Enough, and Die Another Day. Together, his 4 movies earned more than $1.2 billion worldwide. At the time, this was an extraordinary success and marked one of the strongest runs in the franchise's history. Brosnan had not only saved Bond, but had also secured his place as the defining 007 for millions of fans around the world. For now, though, he was at the very top of the film world, but just around the corner was a phone call that would end it all in seconds: the Bond betrayal. By 2004, Pierce Brosnan was at the height of his career. He had starred in 4 James Bond films, earned more than $1 billion at the box office, and helped rescue the franchise when many believed it was finished. He was Bond in the eyes of the world, and he fully expected to continue in the role. Then, while filming the movie After the Sunset in the Bahamas, the phone rang. The call lasted just 47 seconds. The voice on the other end said simply, "You were a great James Bond. Thank you very much. Goodbye." And with that, his time as 007 was over. The decision came as a shock. Brosnan had not been warned. There had been no long conversations about moving on, no discussion of what the future might look like. He later learned that the producers had been auditioning younger actors for 2 years while letting him believe that he was still their choice. The secrecy cut deep. What hurt wasn't only losing the role, but realizing that the trust he thought he had built with the studio had been quietly broken. The fallout from that call was brutal. Almost overnight, 3 major film deals collapsed. Studios that had been eager to work with him suddenly backed away. His salary offers dropped sharply, from $12 million per film to just $3 million. Casting directors began to see him as too Bond, so closely tied to the tuxedoed spy that they could not picture him as anything else. Instead of opening doors, the role that had made him a global star now began to close them. But life wasn't finished testing him yet, because away from Hollywood, far more personal heartbreaks were waiting: love and loss. In the late 1970s, Pierce Brosnan's life changed in a way he could never have predicted. During this time, when his acting career was still uncertain, he met actress Cassandra Harris. She was already established in the industry and carried herself with elegance and warmth. More than her beauty, it was her presence that drew him in. Cassandra was raising 2 children, Charlotte and Christopher, from her previous marriage. Many men might have hesitated at the idea of stepping into an instant family, but not Pierce. From the beginning, he embraced them. He didn't see them as stepchildren, he saw them as his own. Pierce and Cassandra's connection grew quickly. They married in 1980, and 3 years later, their son Sean was born. Together, the 5 of them built a close and happy family. Photographs from that time show Pierce smiling in a way that was different from his polished public image. At home, he was simply a husband and a father, living a life filled with love and stability. For a man who had grown up with so much loss and uncertainty, this was the family he had always longed for. But in 1987, everything changed. While working abroad, Cassandra began to feel an unusual fatigue and pain. At first, it was easy to dismiss as exhaustion from her busy schedule. Soon after, however, doctors gave the devastating news. She had ovarian cancer, and it was already advanced. Pierce later said it felt as though the ground had opened beneath his feet. One day their lives had seemed ordinary, and the next, everything was consumed by illness. The next 4 years were some of the hardest of their lives. Cassandra endured surgeries, months of chemotherapy, and the endless cycle of hospital visits. The treatments took her strength, her hair, and her energy, but they never took away her dignity. She faced her illness with courage, insisting on knowing the truth and making her own decisions. Friends and family admired her determination, while Pierce stood by her side through it all. He called himself the quiet partner, always present, holding her hand and offering what comfort he could. At home, their young son Sean, still just a boy, would sometimes play at being a doctor, putting on a toy stethoscope to care for his mother. It was a sweet but heartbreaking sight, a reminder of how illness had invaded every corner of their family life. For Pierce, the weight of watching both his wife and his children suffer was almost unbearable. On December 28, 1991, just one day after their 11th wedding anniversary, Cassandra died at the age of 43. Pierce was at her side and their children were close by. And as hard as it was to imagine, life was not done testing him, because years later, the same cruel illness would return to his family. The mirror of a mother's fate. For Pierce Brosnan, the deepest wound of his life was losing his wife Cassandra to ovarian cancer in 1991. He believed nothing could ever match that kind of heartbreak. But decades later, the same cruel illness returned, this time striking his daughter Charlotte. It was a repetition of history, so exact and so merciless that it felt almost impossible to bear. Charlotte was bright, warm, and resilient, carrying much of her mother's grace in the way she lived her life. She built a family of her own and was the devoted mother of 2 children, Isabella and Lucas. Then, in her late 30s, she began to feel unwell, tired, achy, and unusually drained. At first, the signs were small, the sort of symptoms that could be explained away by daily stress. But Pierce, who had already walked this road with Cassandra, recognized the rhythm immediately. He knew what was coming, even before doctors confirmed it. When the diagnosis was given, it was the same devastating words he had heard decades earlier: ovarian cancer. For Pierce, it was like being dragged back into a nightmare he had never escaped. He had fought this battle once already, and now he was forced to watch his daughter endure the same slow, brutal progression of the disease. Charlotte's fight lasted 3 years. Like her mother, she faced it with remarkable strength. She went through surgery, chemotherapy, and the endless waiting rooms of hospitals. Each treatment weakened her body, but her spirit stayed strong. Her focus was always on her children. She wanted Isabella and Lucas to remember her not only as someone who was sick, but also as someone who loved them fiercely and faced life with courage. She tried to give them as much time and as many memories as she could. In June 2013, as her health declined, Charlotte made a powerful choice. She married her longtime partner, Alex, in a private ceremony. She wore a white dress, stood proudly despite her failing strength, and smiled through the pain. It was not just a wedding. It was her way of declaring that love, not illness, would have the final word in her life. Just 2 weeks later, on June 28, 2013, Charlotte died at the age of 41. And tragically, this was not the only family struggle that would weigh heavily on his heart. A son lost to life. When Pierce Brosnan married Cassandra Harris in 1980, he didn't just become a husband, he also became a father. Cassandra already had 2 children from her first marriage, Charlotte and Christopher, and Pierce welcomed them into his life without hesitation. He legally adopted both of them, giving them his name and treating them as his own. From the beginning, Christopher and Pierce shared a close bond. In the early years, Christopher often joined Pierce on film sets. He carried cameras, observed the process of filmmaking, and learned the rhythms of storytelling. At home, their relationship was filled with warmth and normal family moments. For a boy who had lost his biological father's presence, Pierce's acceptance and love provided stability. There was no distinction of stepchild or adopted child. Christopher was simply his son and Pierce was his father. But when Cassandra fell ill in 1987, the entire family's world began to unravel. For 4 years, everyone lived in the shadow of her ovarian cancer diagnosis, and Christopher carried much of that pain inside. When she died in 1991, the grief hit him especially hard. While Charlotte found strength in helping keep the family together, and Sean leaned on Pierce for comfort, Christopher withdrew. He struggled to process the loss, and instead of moving through his pain, he turned inward. In the years that followed, those private battles grew into larger struggles. Christopher began to face issues with addiction, At first, the problems were quiet, but they became harder to hide as time went on. There were brushes with the law, moments of near disaster, and episodes where it seemed his life could be lost entirely. The grief that had first weighed on him after his mother's death never left, and it grew into a shadow he could not escape. Pierce did everything a father could to help. He supported Christopher through rehab programs, had countless conversations with him, and gave him chance after chance. Sometimes, he simply sat with him in silence, hoping that his presence would be enough. No matter how difficult things became, he never stopped caring. But as the years passed, it became painfully clear that love alone could not rescue someone who wasn't ready to save themselves. In a rare and honest admission years later, Pierce spoke publicly about his son. He said, "Christopher is still very lost. I know where he is, but he's having a hard life. He knows how to get out. He doesn't want to." There was no anger in his voice, only sadness. For a man who had already endured so much loss, this was another form of grief, the agony of watching a child drift away, still alive but unreachable. And through all this sorrow, there was one person who gave him strength to keep going, someone who helped him find hope again, a second chance at love. In 1994, just months before he would finally step into the role of James Bond, Pierce Brosnan met someone who would change his life forever. At a beach party in Cabo San Lucas, he was introduced to Keely Shea Smith, a journalist and television correspondent. At the time, Pierce was still carrying the heavy grief of losing his wife Cassandra only a few years earlier. He wasn't looking for love, but Keely's warmth and kindness stood out immediately. She didn't see him as the rising Bond star or the actor in a tuxedo. She saw the man who still carried quiet sorrow. Their relationship grew stronger with each passing year. In 2001, they married in a beautiful ceremony at Ballintuber Abbey in Ireland, an abbey more than 800 years old. Surrounded by family and friends, the setting reflected the timelessness of what they were building together. For Pierce, it was more than a wedding. It was a declaration that after so much heartbreak, he was choosing love and life again. Together, Pierce and Keely raised two sons, Dylan and Paris. Family became the center of their world. At home, Keely created a warm and steady environment, one filled with laughter, birthdays, and simple joys. For Pierce, who had already endured the loss of Cassandra and later the devastating illness of Charlotte, this stability was priceless. Being a father again, this time in a home filled with consistency and love, gave him a renewed sense of purpose. Over the years, Keely also faced challenges of her own. After the births of her children, tabloids targeted her appearance with harsh criticism. Rather than stay silent, Pierce defended her openly. He dismissed the negativity and spoke proudly of his love for her, saying, "I love every curve of her body. She is the most beautiful woman in my eyes." His loyalty never wavered, and his words reminded everyone that their bond was built on something far deeper than appearances. In 2024, Keely made headlines again, this time for her own reasons. She lost over 100 pounds, not to answer critics, but to improve her health. She spoke about honoring her body for everything it had carried: love, children, and sorrow. For Pierce, this was no surprise. He had always seen her strength. To the world, it was a revelation, but to him, it was simply who she had always been. Pierce often says that Keely saved him. She gave him the will to keep living, to find joy again after unimaginable loss. With her, he built not just a family, but a future. The man behind the tragedy. Today, at 72, Pierce Brosnan is admired around the world for his elegance, charm, and unforgettable turn as James Bond. To many, he is still the smooth, secret agent who always saved the day. But behind the polished public image lies a man who has endured some of life's harshest blows. His story is not only about fame or film, it is about survival, resilience, and the ability to keep moving forward even when the losses seem endless. Brosnan carries his grief quietly. He does not speak of it often, but it is present in his voice, in his memories, and in the way he talks about family. He lost his first wife, Cassandra, to ovarian cancer, a tragedy that left him a widower with 3 children to care for. Years later, he lost his daughter Charlotte to the same disease, watching her fade in the same way he had seen her mother suffer. He has also lived with the sorrow of seeing his adopted son Christopher struggle for decades with addiction, forced to love him from a distance when efforts to help were no longer enough. These are wounds that do not close with time. What makes Brosnan's story striking is the way he carries this pain while still showing strength. He has spoken openly about the fact that he does not wear his grief as a badge, but that it has become part of him, woven into his very being. Rather than letting it define him publicly, he lives with it privately, choosing instead to put forward a calm and steady face to the world. The tuxedoed image of James Bond may be the role that defined his career, but the reality is that Brosnan's true strength comes from the tragedies he has endured away from the cameras. Through it all, love has been his anchor. His relationship with Keely Shea Smith gave him the stability and hope he needed after Cassandra's death. With her, he built a home for their two sons, Dylan and Paris, and created a space filled with warmth, despite the shadows of the past. Keely stood by him during Charlotte's illness, when old grief returned with unbearable force. She became the constant that allowed him to keep going, protecting him when the weight of sorrow was too heavy to carry alone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more.